I watched a man get humiliated in a room full of people, and not one person said a word, including me. I've thought about that morning for a long time since. What it means to stay quiet when staying quiet is the easiest thing in the world to do. This is what happened. The hearing room on the third floor of the Brampton Municipal Courthouse was the kind of space that felt important without doing much to earn it. Dark oak paneling on 3 walls, a provincial seal bolted slightly crooked above the adjudicator's bench, fluorescent lights that buzzed just loud enough to notice when the room went silent. It seated maybe 40 people in wooden gallery chairs that creaked every time someone shifted their weight. On a Tuesday morning in late October, those 40 seats were nearly full. The case on the docket was a civil disciplinary hearing, a labor grievance brought by a 47-year-old school custodian named Reginald Osei against the Peel District School Board. Reginald had been suspended without pay after a vice principal, a man named Deputy Adjudicator Holt presiding, claimed Reginald had been verbally insubordinate during a staff meeting. The board's position was that he had raised his voice, refused a direct instruction, and created a hostile environment for administrative staff. Reginald had said nothing of the sort. He'd asked a question. That was all. He sat at the respondent's table in a gray blazer he'd bought at a value village in Mississauga 3 days before the hearing, because he didn't own one and didn't know if he needed one, and a neighbor told him it would help to look professional. The blazer was slightly too large in the shoulders. He'd kept his hands folded on the table since he sat down. He hadn't moved them once. He was a quiet man, the kind of quiet that people sometimes mistake for having nothing to say. His lawyer, a young duty counsel named Janelle Tremblay, who had been assigned to his file 11 days before the hearing and had met him exactly twice, sat beside him with a legal pad covered in shorthand. She was 29, thorough, slightly overwhelmed, and doing her best. She believed him. She just wasn't sure yet how to prove it. Across the room, the board was represented by a senior labor litigator named Harding. He had 22 years of experience handling exactly this kind of case and wore the confidence of someone who had never once lost sleep over the outcome. Harding called his first witness, the vice principal. A man named Vice Principal Cleary walked to the front of the room and settled into the witness chair like he owned it. He was 42, well-dressed, and had the smooth certainty of someone who had never been seriously questioned about anything he believed. He described the incident the way a person describes a bad dream they've rehearsed into something more coherent than it ever actually was. Reginald had raised his voice. Reginald had refused. Reginald had made the atmosphere uncomfortable. He used the word aggressive twice. He used the phrase the other staff felt unsafe once. He did not look at Reginald while he said any of this. Reginald sat with his hands still folded and watched the ceiling for a moment, then looked back at the table. Janelle cross-examined carefully, methodically. She established that there were no written complaints filed at the time, that Cleary had waited 6 days before submitting his incident report, that no one else in the meeting had been interviewed before the suspension was issued. Cleary had an answer for each of these points. The answers weren't good, but he delivered them without flinching, and Adjudicator Holt, a man in his late 50s who had been doing these hearings for 16 years and whose default expression was one of mild procedural impatience, let them stand. Then Harding called his second witness. A woman in the gallery stood up. Her name was Beverly Ann Quartermain. She was 53 years old, and she had been sitting in the second row since the hearing opened, still as furniture. She was a support worker at the school, one of 2 educational assistants assigned to the room where the incident had taken place. She wore a navy cardigan and flat shoes, and her hair was pulled back simply. She looked like someone's aunt. She walked to the front of the room the way people walk to the front of rooms when they are not trying to be noticed. Harding smiled pleasantly. He asked her to state her name for the record. She did. He asked her to describe what she'd witnessed the morning of September 14th. She said, "I'll need a moment." Holt looked up from his notes. "Ma'am, please answer the question." Beverly Ann looked at the adjudicator without expression. "I said I'll need a moment, sir." There was a shift in the room, very slight. the kind of shift you feel before you see. She reached into her cardigan pocket and produced a small card. She set it quietly on the ledge in front of her and did not pick it up again. Holt said, "What is that?" she said. "I'll explain it when it becomes relevant. For now, I'd like to answer Mr. Harding's question." Holt studied her for a moment. He did not push further. Something in her manner made him choose not to. Harding, who had expected this witness to deliver a clean, corroborating account and exit in under 10 minutes, felt the faint edge of something he couldn't name and pressed forward. He asked her again to describe what she'd seen on September 14th. Beverly Ann said, "I was in the room for the entirety of the meeting. I was seated 2 rows behind Mr. Osei." She paused. Reginald asked Mr. Cleary to repeat the new reporting schedule because it conflicted with the building maintenance window he'd been given the week prior. He didn't raise his voice. He raised his hand first, and when he was acknowledged, he spoke clearly and politely and sat back down. Mr. Cleary said he'd look into it. The meeting continued. That was the whole of it. Harding's smile didn't disappear, but it thinned, Ms. Quatermain, he said, drawing the name out slightly. The way people do when they want to imply that the name itself is in question. Are you certain of that? Yes. You weren't perhaps distracted, checking your phone, attending to your own responsibilities. I was present and attentive for the full duration of the meeting, she said. That's my job, and you're prepared to state under oath that Mr. Osei did not raise his voice. He did not raise his voice. Harding set down his pen. He picked up a sheet of paper. He said, "I have here a sworn statement from a second support worker who was in the same room and who recalls the incident differently." Beverly Ann said, "I imagine you do." Holt said, "Mrs. Quatermain, I'm not being dismissive," she said. "I'm saying I understand that a second statement exists. It doesn't change what I observed." Harding decided to try a different angle. He had used it before. It worked more often than it should. He said, "Mrs. Quatermain, you and Mr. Osei have worked in the same building for how many years?" 6. You know him personally, professionally. You describe yourselves as friendly, collegial. Collegial, Harding repeated, smiling at the room the way you smile when you think you've made a point. Is it possible that your recollection of events is influenced by a desire to help a colleague you're fond of? The room was very quiet. Beverly Ann looked at him for a long moment. She didn't look away. She didn't look offended. She looked patient, in the specific way of someone who has been waiting for a particular door to open and is now watching it open exactly as expected. She said, "Mr. Harding, I'd like you to look at the card I placed on the ledge." Harding glanced at it. It was a standard-issue government identification card, the kind with a photo, a name, and a service designation. The provincial seal was in the upper left corner. The kind of card that means something specific in a room like this one. He stopped. Beverly Ann Quatermain, Beverly Ann, who wore navy cardigans and flat shoes and had been sitting in that room since before 9 a.m., like she had nowhere more important to be, was a retired investigator from the Ontario Civilian Police Commission, 18 years of service. She had left the commission 4 years ago and taken a part-time position at the school because she'd wanted, as she later described it to Janelle in the hallway afterward, something quieter. Something that mattered in a smaller way. She had not mentioned this to anyone at the school. It had never come up. "Why would it?" she said. "I spent 18 years assessing the accuracy and credibility of eyewitness testimony for the Provincial Commission. I know what I observe, and I know how to observe it. My account of September 14th is not colored by personal affection. It is what happened. The room did not move. Not Harding, not Cleary, who had turned in his seat to look at her, not the woman from the board's HR department who had been taking careful notes and had now stopped. Not the 2 people from the gallery who had been leaning slightly forward and now sat very, very still. Adjudicator Holt looked at the card. He looked at it for a long time. He said, "Miss Quatermain, can you confirm the name and designation on that identification?" She did, calmly, without drama. Holt set down his pen. In 22 years of practice, Harding had never once asked a witness to explain their professional background before putting them on the stand. He'd looked at the board's witness list, seen a support worker, and built his cross-examination on the assumption that she was nothing more complicated than that. It was the kind of shortcut that works 9 times out of 10 and catastrophically fails the 10th. He said, "I'd like to request a brief recess." Holt said, "Granted." During the recess, Harding spoke privately with the board's HR representative in the corridor outside. Janelle Tremblay stood near the water fountain with Reginald and tried to explain, in measured terms, what had just happened. Reginald listened. He nodded. He said, "I know who she is." Janelle looked at him. I didn't know about the commission," he said, "but I know she's careful. She's always been careful." He looked down the hallway to where Beverly Ann was standing alone near a window, looking out at the parking lot below. She had her hands clasped behind her back, and she looked like someone who had simply been waiting for a bus that had now arrived. Reginald said, "She didn't have to do that," Janelle said. "No, she didn't. She could have just said what she saw and left it at that." "She did say what she saw," Janelle said, "and then she made sure they couldn't dismiss it." Reginald was quiet for a moment. "That's the thing about this kind of hearing," he said. "It's not really about what happened. It's about what they can make people believe happened." "I know that. I've always known that." He wasn't angry when he said it. He was just tired. The kind of tired that comes not from a single morning, but from a long accumulation of mornings just like it. When the hearing resumed, Harding's manner had changed in ways that were subtle but visible to anyone paying attention. He asked fewer rhetorical questions. He stopped performing certainty. Janelle called Reginald to speak on his own behalf. He walked to the front of the room the same way he'd walked into the building that morning, unhurried, unremarkable, in a blazer slightly too large in the shoulders. He sat. He placed his hands flat on the ledge. Janelle asked him to describe his understanding of the meeting on September 14th. He did. He spoke clearly and without embellishment. He said that he had raised his hand. He said that he had been acknowledged. He said that he had asked about a scheduling conflict and sat back down when Cleary said he'd look into it. He said that was all. Janelle asked if he understood why a suspension had followed. Reginald looked at the table for a moment. He said, "I've been doing this job for 11 years. I come in early, I stay late. I don't call in sick unless I'm actually sick. I know every teacher's name and most of the kids' names and which hallways flood when it rains hard and which boilers run cold in the morning and need time to warm up. I know this building the way I know my own home. And I think sometimes, when you know something that well and you're still treated like you don't belong at the table, I think sometimes the only way to stay sane is to just ask the question. That's what I did. I asked the question." He didn't say anything after that. The room held it. Holt looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at his notes. Then he looked at Beverly Ann, who was back in the gallery, and looking at nothing in particular. The ruling came 8 days later, by letter. Reginald Osei's suspension was overturned. The board was ordered to restore his back pay in full. A formal notation was made in the record regarding the adjudicator's concern about the accuracy and completeness of the evidence submitted by the board in support of the original suspension. The letter did not mention Vice Principal Cleary by name, but it noted that certain witness accounts had been found to be inconsistent with corroborating testimony deemed credible by the panel. It did not recommend further action against anyone. That was the part that stayed with Janelle after. The part that reminded her why she'd gone into duty counsel work in the first place. Not because the system was just, but because it was the only system there was, and someone had to try to make it work for the people it usually didn't. She filed the ruling in Reginald's folder and marked the case closed. 2 months later, Reginald Osei went back to the school on a Monday morning. He let himself in through the side entrance, the one that only staff with building keys used, and walked the long corridor to his equipment room. He unlocked it, changed into his work clothes, filled his cart. He started at the north end of the building the way he always did, because the north corridor got the most foot traffic in the morning and needed to be clear before the students arrived. He didn't announce that he was back. There was no announcement. He swept the hallway. He emptied the bins. He checked the boiler, which was running cold that morning, and adjusted the settings the way he'd learned 2 years ago. the way no one else in the building knew to do. When the first bell rang and the hallways filled with sound and motion, Reginald Osei was already done with the north end and halfway through the east wing, moving at the same steady, unhurried pace he always kept. Beverly Ann passed him near the gymnasium door at 9:15. She nodded to him. He nodded back. That was all. Beverly Ann Quartermain had never told anyone at the school about her previous career. She hadn't hidden it exactly. It simply had never been asked, and she had never offered. She'd been a support worker for 4 years. She was good at the job. She liked the students. She liked the rhythm of a school day, the way it had a shape to it, a beginning and an end, something that her years at the commission had sometimes lacked. When Janelle had called her after the ruling to thank her, Beverly Ann had been brief. She said, "I said what happened. That's all." Janelle said, "You didn't have to show the card." Beverly Ann was quiet for a moment. "No," she said, "but I knew what would happen if I didn't. I've sat in enough of those rooms to know exactly what happens when someone decides the witness doesn't look credible, and I wasn't going to let that happen to an honest account." There was a pause. Janelle said, "Have you been in rooms like that before? Personally, I mean, not professionally." Another pause. Longer. Beverly Ann said, "My whole life, sweetheart." She said goodbye and hung up. The morning Reginald sat in that hearing room, in his borrowed blazer, hands folded on the table, waiting to be believed. That morning, 40-some people were in the same room with him. Most of them worked for the institution that was trying to dismiss him. Some of them were neutral. Observers, clerks, a journalist from a local education beat who had come on a slow news day and left before lunch. And some of them were just people, parents maybe, bystanders, people who had wandered into the wrong floor and found themselves sitting in a room where something was happening that they hadn't planned to witness. None of them said anything. I've thought about that a lot since. What it costs to say something. What it costs, in a different way, not to. The particular arithmetic of a room where everyone is waiting for someone else to be the one. The thing is, Beverly Ann wasn't in that room to be a hero. She wasn't performing anything. She had seen what she'd seen, and she had said so. And when the machinery of the room moved to discard what she'd said, because she didn't look like someone whose account would hold weight, she had simply opened her pocket and let the truth do what truth does when you give it space. That's the thing that stays with me. Not the card, not the credentials, but the fact that she had been sitting there quietly, the whole time waiting to be asked, and when she was ready. I wonder sometimes what you would do if you were in that room, if you were one of the 40 people in those creaking wooden chairs, if you watched a quiet man in an ill-fitting blazer wait to be believed, and you knew, really knew, what had happened, what it would cost you to say so. What it would cost you not to. I don't think there's an easy answer. I think most of us in that moment would calculate. We'd think about what we stand to lose and what we stand to gain, and we'd arrive at silence almost without deciding to. That's not cowardice, exactly. It's something more complicated and more human than that. But I also think about Beverly Ann, who calculated too, and arrived somewhere different. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you've ever been in a room where the truth needed someone to stand behind it, drop it in the comments. I read them. Everyone.